It's a topic that gets brought up a lot within the medical community. It's a topic that gets brought up quite often within the household, particularly when we start looking at women and as they age. It's a topic that we like to discuss quite often. Why does everybody seem to worry about osteoporosis, and what does it have to do with pathophysiology? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
So we keep getting told that the worse we eat, the worse our health will be. That if we don't quit smoking, if we don't quit drinking, that we're going to have to worry about our bone health. That if we stress out and keep stressing, our health is going to be worse. That we have to work out, that we have to eat healthy in order to have healthy bones. But how true is that? What about the medical diagnosing that comes to play as relates to osteoporosis for women as they age? Is it true that simply being older is going to make me have osteoporotic bones if I happen to be a woman? Well, part of this has to deal with the impact that we look at in terms of normal bone turnover and normal bone health. Which remembers is that we're trying to maximize the rate of mineralization that takes place as we age so that we have maximum amount of bone density and maximum amount of bones during this turnover phase. I'm going to highly recommend you go ahead and watch the full discussion that we have as it relates to normal bone health and normal bone turnover within the normal physiology videos. What we're trying to do here in terms of normal bone health and normal bone turnover is make sure that we are remineralizing what gets lost during the turnover phase, where we'll be turning over our entire skeleton basically once a decade. Or it's going to be a combination of osteoclastic and osteoblastic activity that's going to lead to the development of the various bone tissues that we have and the maintenance of those bone tissues as we go through our life. That maintenance of the bone tissue is going to be dependent upon a whole host of factors. Well, if we want to increase the rate of mineralization that's there, we want to make sure that we are weight bearing, that we are having good hormonal signals that are going to lead to bone growth. Whereas if we're going to worry about loss of mineralizations, it's about losing bone loading or having higher amounts of inflammation. Overall, the way in which the bone is maintained is based off of the SAID principle and Wolff's law of bone remodeling, where we're trying to make sure that all of the ions are arranged in such a way so that we're able to maintain the piezoelectric neutral axis. Where we're going to have changes in osteocytic activity based off of hormonal signals and based off of metabolic signals that's going to ultimately change the geometry of the bone based off of having different clastic and blastic activities within different areas of the bone. We're going to have a host of controlling factors in terms of bone metabolism and bone morphology that we're going to take a look at as we look at these various diseases that we have to worry about, whether they be hormonal factors or genetic factors or mechanical force factors, which remembers is that no matter what we do, if we do not load the bone will not stay healthy. And then we talk about the nutrition factors, where everybody likes to focus on calcium and vitamin D, but there's other factors that come into play. We have to remember that nothing happens unless we load the bone. Where we have to remember the activities that we do throughout the day is going to impact how healthy the bone happens to be, even with all the other factors that come into play. Which is why when we look at the medicines for bone disease issues, they're always going to have an activity component to it and a nutrition component to it. Where we have our normal bones, and when we start loading the bones, we're going to trigger bone growth to take place. We want the bones to grow as robust as possible, to become as strong as possible, to become as hypertrophied as possible, so that when we get to the point of consolidation and go through involution, we're able to have peak bone mineral density and maintain that bone mineral density. Where if we do not reach peak bone mineral density, we're going to lose bone quite quickly. And the way in which we're going to be able to keep that bone around is by loading the bone. We want to make sure that our bone's going to stay in this normal or in this hypertrophied state and not succumb to the atrophied state that happens with bone loss or with bone diseases that we're going to take a look at here. And so we start looking at this issue about bone health and bone issues as relates to bone loss. This is where we start looking at the ideas about pathophysiology as relates to the bone diseases. Whether that bone disease is osteoporosis or osteopenia or rickets or osteomalacia, just to name a few. There are other diseases out there. Paget's disease is another one that's out there as relates to this bone health issue. The big ones that we're going to take a look at here are osteoporosis, osteopenia, and the rickets osteomalacia issues that come into play. So, what is osteoporosis and osteopenia? Because we tend to get these two confused quite a lot when we start looking at this idea here. Osteopenia is uncoupled balance between osteoclastic and osteoblastic activity that will lead to a reduction in peak bone mineral density that will take place during the growth phase and during the remineralization phase, where we're going to lose bone mineral density that's going to come into play here. Whereas osteoporosis is going to be one of the root causes for the reduction in bone loss that we see, where we have two distinct causes that come to play. We have a genetic cause where we're going to have low osteoblastic to osteoclastic activation, or we're going to have hormonal activation where we're going to have low anabolic responses and high inflammatory responses. This is where we're going to have distinct differences in the way in which bones are going to turn over, where we can get a reduction in bone mineral density during the growth phase from some of these hormonal factors and some of these genetic factors that will lead to a lower total peak bone mineral density at the end of the growth phase, which means that we're going to have less bone there to start the lossing. And because we have less bone there when we start the lossing, we're going to have a reduction in mineralization that takes place during the turnover phases. The whole idea here in between the osteopenia and the osteoporosis is a root value or a base value of 0.9 grams of bone mineral per square centimeter in terms of that bone mineral density issue that we look at as being that kind of diagnostic difference that we're looking at. Where osteopenia is going to be the loss of bone tissue, the death of bone tissue that we look at here. We associate osteoporosis with a genealogical heritage, with gender, with age, with history of smoking or current smoking, with poor diet, and with low exercise. However, we have to look at this in terms of differential diagnosing, in terms of is it an osteopenic reduction leading to osteoporosis in terms of a clinical diagnosis, or is it a genetic issue in terms of osteoporosis where we do not get the correct amount of bone mineral density throughout age? However we look at this, what we have to do is we have to look at how we go about diagnosing. It's based off of what's referred to as a Z-score in terms of bone mineral density, sometimes referenced within books as a T-score. This Z-score idea is how far away from the mean value that we have within the population, this black line within the graph, the population happens to be, the person happens to be relative to where they should be based off of mean value for their gender, for their weight, for all of the other factors that come into play. If I'm above that zero line, if I'm like +1, etc., I do not have to worry about having a diagnosis of osteopenia or osteoporosis. However, as I get lower in that Z line score, if I get less than 1 in terms of the Z line or the T score, TZ score, BMD, I have to start worrying about osteopenic issues coming into play. If I get below 2 on that, where I'm more than 2 standard deviations below where I should be in terms of the Z score for bone mineral density, now I have to worry about having osteoporotic diagnosing. It doesn't necessarily mean that I have the genetic issues that are going to come into play in terms of whether I have enough bone there to start with, but I do not have enough bone, period. And so one of the things that we look at in terms of this diagnostic issue here is we tend to look at it in terms of an older aged issue or a female issue in terms of the social gender ideology here. While we do have a higher risk for osteoporotic changes and a clinical diagnosis of osteoporosis postmenopausal in women due to some hormonal fluctuations, if I have an osteoporosis issue where it's going to be a true genetic osteoporosis issue and not a hormonal, inflammatory, or dietary impacted osteoporotic change, I'm going to have low bone mineral density throughout my lifespan. And this is where we have to differentiate between osteopenic caused osteoporosis, this is where I have excessive amounts of loss of bone mineral density leading to the diagnosing of osteoporosis, versus just having low bone mineral density throughout life, leading to lower rates of turnover, lower rates of remineralization during turnover phases as I head out, and then lose some of the protective factors that I have in terms of hormonal protective factors as I get later in age. If I have the true osteoporotic genetic condition here, I'm going to be low throughout the lifespan. If I have it simply due to changes of steroid hormones, of anabolic hormones, of inflammatory hormones later on in life, then I'm going to have osteopenic changes leading to osteoporotic changes. And this is where we have to be very careful in terms of, are we doing clinical diagnosing of osteoporosis, or if we have true osteoporotic change throughout life. Sometimes we're going to have that osteoporotic change throughout life be diagnosed as other types of issues. So how do we go about dealing with this kind of osteoporotic change throughout life and in terms of having low bone mineral density at the end of that growth phase? And this is where, if we look at the activation of the osteoblasts, when what happens, we don't get enough activation of osteoblasts or enough differentiation of our stem cells to be osteoblasts, to allow for enough promotion, enough activation, and enough maturation of the osteocytes into osteoblastic cells to allow for a large enough amount of bone mineral densities to be deposited during the growth phase and during the consolidation phase. If we look at hormones that are going to come into play as it relates to these issues here, we have osteocalin, we have osteonectin, we have osteopotin, we have bone salad protein, and then we have Rankel L in terms of activation proteins. Those proteins are going to come into play as it relates to this idea about converting the osteocytes in between their forms, in between being osteoblastic and osteoclastic, and the regulation in particular of the osteoclastic differentiation. And this is where we have to worry about stimulation or inhibition of the Rankel gene in particular. And that Rankel protein, the Rankel gene, is going to be one of the key regulators in terms of this osteoclastic activity. And this is where we start looking at hormonal activation factors and secondary inflammatory factors. The inability to activate osteoblasts and the overactivation of osteoclastic activity following the growth phase and within the consolidation phase is what's going to lead to the osteopenic change. And that osteopenic change, if we get a low enough bone mineral density, leading to diagnosing of clinical osteoporosis. In this, we have distinct various factors going to come into play in between our normal bone. And by normal, we're talking about a normal healthy bone, even when the bone is older, versus the older unhealthy bone. And that older unhealthy bone is going to have high amounts of inflammation taking place. And that high amounts of inflammation taking place inhibiting the activation of the lining cells to become blastic in nature, where we're going to have a higher, not really a higher activation of osteoclastic activity, but we're going to have an uncoupling of osteoclastic to osteoblastic activity that's going to lead to an increased absorption of the bone mineral density that will lead to that osteopenic and osteoporotic changes that will lead to the clinical diagnosing of osteoporosis. And it really has to do with epigenetic modifications and dysregulation, in particular on mitochondrial and microRNA signals, that leads to different changes taking place due to high amounts of inflammation and high amounts of inflammatory responses that will stimulate additional osteoclastic progenitor cells that will lead to additional osteoclastic activity, leading to more uncoupling in between the blastic and the clastic activity during turnover. And this is going to lead to the greater rate of loss that takes place in the osteoporotic bone versus the normal healthy bone. And all this is based off of inflammatory changes that take place in the bone and a reduction in the overall changes that we might see in terms of activations taking place. Where if we start looking at this in terms of a holistic approach, looking at the image from Zhao's article here with some modifications to some of the captioning, where what we're doing is we're looking at a lifestyle imbalance where we have an increase in fatness and a reduction in fitness signaling. That increase in fatness and reduction in signaling is going to cause changes in our steroidogenesis increase in glucocorticoids, reduction of androgens, reductions of estrogens, regardless of when we are within age. What that's going to do is that's going to cause changes in how RONCL is going about being activated, how other factors are coming into activation, TNF alpha, IL-6, IL-1, just to name a few. That is going to lead to that imbalance that we see in the absorption versus remineralization that we should normally see taking place within normal bone turnover. And once again, please go and look at the discussion in terms of normal bone turnover and the factors that come into play as relates to normal bone turnover. The other thing that's going to come into play as we start looking at this idea about the fitness and fatness continuum moving more towards fatness and less towards fitness is changes in vasculature function, in particular vascular dysregulation, that vascular dysregulation causing changes in terms of ischemia taking place within the bones, which is going to cause an additional imbalance taking place. All of those factors, the immune dysfunction, the vascular dysfunction, the hormonal dysfunction, is what's going to lead to changes within the bone mineral density that's going to trigger that osteoporotic change. This is where we want to make it sound like it's due to having losses of estrogens, losses of testosterone, losses of normal metabolic functions, even though we do see a high correlation in between gender and the disease prevalence. Part of it has to deal with the imbalance that takes place in terms of vascular dysfunction and the imbalance that comes into play as it relates to bone homeostatic regulation, bone homeostatic modifications. But a lot of this has to deal with not necessarily the hormone itself, what that hormone does in terms of secondary activations within the bone itself. The estrogen is not by itself going to lead to uh, increases of bone formation or bone mineralization. This is where we get this confusion of, oh, I'm gonna if I lose estrogen at menopause, I'm automatically gonna get osteoporosis. It's not that clear cut. It's a very convoluted set of scenarios that are coming into play, and that convoluted set of scenarios coming into play has to deal with how the bone is being used, how the bone is being metabolized. Estrogen will have an impact on how two of the key regulators that happen are going to function. Osteocalin is going to be one of the things that we have to worry about in terms of androgen response. This sale protein is going to be important in terms of formation of hydroxyapatite and sticking calcium onto the phosphates, leading to the alignment of the ions, the calcium phosphate ions within the hydroxyapatite. And all those can get impacted by this steroidogenic imbalance, by this imbalance in between how many glucocorticoids we have in play versus how many androgens and estrogens we have in play. And so to simply stipulate that osteoporosis is coming about because of age or because of gender kind of oversimplifies the idea as to what is taking place. What we have to do is we have to look at in terms of when did the disease initially set in? Is it due to not getting the correct osteoblastic maturations taking place, leading to low bone mineral density at the end of growth, the beginning of consolidation? Or is it due to an imbalance in between osteoblastic and osteoclastic activity, leading to greater amounts of absorption and less amounts of remineralization? Within that idea about absorption and remineralization, we have other hormones that people like to speak about as coming into play, in particular the vitamin D issues coming into play, the calcium and the calcitronin and calcitrol issues coming into play, the parathyroid hormones coming into play. While they do have an impact on some of the calcium depositing taking place, they do not have the level of impact on osteoblastic and osteoclastic activity relative to the other hormones that we do know come into play as it relates to bone health and bone disease issues. The other kind of pathophysiology that comes into play as it relates to bone health and bone physiology is rickets or osteomalacia. Now, the difference between rickets and osteomalacia is when do we start seeing signs and symptoms of issues here? The causes for both is altered vitamin D, where we're either going to have altered vitamin D production, altered vitamin D receptor activation, altered vitamin D metabolism from the inactive form to the active form, hypophosphatemia or hypocalcemia. There is some indication of medications come into play. There is a genetic component that can come into play, particularly for the rickets issue. But regardless of what the cause is, the impact here is impaired mineralization of the bone matrix. That impaired mineralization of the bone matrix, we get signs and symptoms very similar to what we see in terms of ion imbalance, particularly calcium ion imbalance, particularly hypocalcium ion imbalance. But the other thing we're going to start seeing is we will see, particularly within weight bearing limbs, an irregularity of bony architecture where we can see bow-leggedness, particularly within young individuals, children, where the femur, due to changes in the tension and compression lines along the cortical rings of the bone, because of improper bone mineralization, leading to a bowing of the femur. We can have irregularity within the loading areas of the condyles of the femur, as well as the condyles of the tibia, leading to either knock knee or bow knee activations taking place or activities taking place within those articulations, where we have irregular gait coming about, where we'll have a waddling gait coming about. And once again, we start talking about what is the root cause here in terms of it is an osteomalacia or a rickets. It doesn't really matter in terms of the signs and symptoms that we see. It's about when do we see the onset of the issues. And what we're going to see is we're going to see a softening, the quotes around that, of the bones that are there in terms of the pathophysiology that's come into play. And so when we start looking at what is the pathophysiology and how the pathophysiology is going to look, one of the things we have to look at here is what type of alterations might we see in terms of either the vitamin D factors, whether it is going to be malabsorption issues, whether it's going to be vitamin D deficiency issues, whether it's going to be a hypophosphastasis issue, where we have too low of phosphates, whether it's a hypocalcemia issue, too low of calcium, whether it's vitamin D dependent responses. What we're going to see is we're going to see changes in both gene activation, changes in hormone activation, in particular fibroblast growth factor, in particular activated form of vitamin D. Those factors are going to lead to reduction in total mineralization taking place, and the reduction in total mineralization taking place is what's going to lead to the weakening of the bones and the bone irregularity in terms of its bone overall bone growth that we'll see within people who have rickets or people who have osteomalacia. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Hopefully, got a bit out of the quick pathology discussion of bone health. There are a whole bunch of other bone diseases and bone issues that we will hopefully be taking care of in future videos. So please watch for upcoming videos on more on bone health or on different diseases that we will be covering within the pathophysiology diseases. Please make sure you're following us here on the YouTube as well as on the podcast. Check out the written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes we post to Instagram and to Threads.